Welcome, everybody, to our heritage presentation this evening. I'm your host, Glenn Chadwick, and I'm a board member of the Beach and East Toronto Historical Society. Right now, I would like to introduce our speaker for tonight. Richard White is a historian and a lecturer at the University of Toronto. He's published several books and is currently preparing a history of the beaches, which is slated for publication a little later this year. And coincidentally, he's also a longtime beaches resident. And so please welcome Richard White for tonight's presentation. Thank you.
And here I am. Thank you very much, Glenn. And good evening to you all. I would just like to say thanks to the Society for having me, and to Glenn for organizing this event, and of course to all of you who have tuned in, as we used to say in the 20th century. I'll begin here just talking for a few minutes before I begin showing you my PowerPoint pictures. I thought it would be good to say a few words about what I'm going to say before I actually begin saying it. And I should also maybe just give a brief warning here that this is my first time talking about what I've written. And whenever I do this, I've done it a few times, it'll be a little halting. New ideas will come to me as I'm speaking. So, and I will also be relying on my notes quite a bit to convey all this. So anyway, my presentation tonight will consist of three, what I call historical sites in the beaches, and that's sites SIGHTS. I created a website back in November with 10 of these sites, and the Society has kindly posted a link to that site on its site. So some of you might already have seen parts of what I'm going to be talking about. But I hope that what I say tonight will expand a little bit on what is on the website articles. Now, I coined this term historical sites while I was working on the history of the beaches neighborhood over the last few years. It's premised on an idea that comes mostly from the academic discipline of urban landscape studies, or sometimes more broadly, just historical landscape studies. When you look at a city from the perspective of this specialty, basically whatever you see is a historical source of some kind, because it reveals something about the conditions, the circumstances in which this thing was created, and also usually about the person or the agent that did the creating. So it's as simple as that. I refer to this as an academic field, but it's fairly straightforward, and it actually makes good sense, which not all academic fields do, but we'll leave that for now. As I progressed in my research and I walked about the neighborhood a lot, I began to notice that there were certain places or specific views that had especially interesting things to tell me about the neighborhood's history. Now, these were views in the everyday urban landscape. I stress that word everyday. They were not important places or important buildings. So I coined this term historical sites as a deliberate pun on the term, more conventional term, historical sites, SITES, which are always of important places or important buildings. But my historical sites, SIGHTS, are all very unimportant, although the history they have to tell us is, in my opinion, of course, very important. Now, a bit more about this, because as I developed my ideas further, I realized I was actually uncovering two related, but separate, discrete things. One was simply the basic history of what I'm looking at, of my site. Or in other words, I was asking and trying to answer the standard historical questions of who, what, when, where, and why. So if I'm looking at a streetscape or a building or some open space or someone's backyard, I'm asking myself, well, who created this? Who's responsible for it looking the way it does? When did they do this? Why did they do it? Now, such questions are not always easy to answer, as many of you will know who have done some historical research. But the answers, once you find them, do tend to be factual. The building permit tells us that the application was made by Mr. So-and-so in 1929, that kind of thing. And I did do a fair amount of research into these factual historical details. But the other thing I was finding was less factual and more what I might call interpretive. And I hope also, in most cases, more original, but admittedly, somewhat speculative. So it was with this duality in mind that I made up this subtitle for the talk tonight of New Findings and New Interpretations. The findings being more factual and the interpretations being, well, what I just said. And I should add that some of the sites lean more toward the first and some towards the second, but we'll just leave that for now. And I thought that to give you just to conclude this these introductory remarks, what I might do is just show you briefly a couple of examples without going into either the facts or the interpretation in much detail. So let me start my PowerPoint now. And yeah, this is okay. This is the first. So I'm assuming now that this PowerPoint is visible by everybody. And maybe if there's a problem with it, if it's not there, maybe someone can somehow notify me. Okay, anyway, I'm assuming you all, as many of you know, this whole process of talking to your computer at your desk is something that one never gets used to. So anyway, this is an image from one of my historical sites, SIGHTS, which I've entitled Kenilworth and Kippendavie, an enclave of no certain age. Now, it is indeed a piece of everyday landscape. I'm sure many of you have walked by this. It's on Kippendavie Avenue. As I was walking around this enclave, which is basically the old original part of the Kew Beach community, I was struck by how much infill I saw. I felt that maybe I was seeing more infill here than anywhere else in the neighborhood. And not only was there a lot of infill, but the infill came from different times. In a photograph like this, for instance, we see on the right, there's a duplex or apartment building that it was probably built in the 60s, maybe, I would guess. Whereas over on the left, there's a more modern building that was probably built in the last 10 or 20 years. And I became quite captivated by this fact that everywhere I looked, I saw a different decade. And so this is why I hatched this term, an enclave of no certain age, because I sort of felt like it was all ages, even though it had originally been built at a certain time. So, but not only that, I went a little bit deeper into that thinking when I realized that the reason why there was so much infill in this area is that it was the first built residential area. For the most part, that's the case, the Kew Beach community. And many of the houses built there were not very solid. They were wooden frame, wooden clad, and had questionable foundations. And so over the century, more than a century since they were built, more of them have been demolished, replaced, substantially rebuilt than elsewhere in the neighborhood. So this is what I mean by looking at an everyday landscape and trying to learn some history from it. Now, if I go on to just one more of these, let's see if this, there we are. This is another everyday landscape that I'm sure all of you will have seen many times. This is in what we now call the Glen Manor area. This is in a historical site which I title the Designed District. The reason for that being that it is the only part of the Beaches neighborhood which is truly designed. And I say that meaning two things. the neighborhood itself, the street layout and the grading and whatnot, was designed by landscape architects. But the houses are also designed by architects. The company that developed the whole area stipulated that anyone who owned a lot intending to build a house, that house had to be architect designed. So that's why it's the designed district. Now, if you take a step into that, though, and you start looking at the design, the housing, a lot of it anyway, is of what's sometimes referred to as arts and crafts style, or sometimes neo-Tudor. And that's a nostalgic style that was popular in the Anglo world in the late 19th and early 20th century. Sort of backward looking, I guess one might say, or nostalgic. It was popular in a lot of the English garden suburbs that were built in those years. But the other curious thing that began to occur to me as I looked around is the number of built-in garages. And of course, what we're seeing here is not only the nostalgia of the neo-Tudor design, but the new age of automobility. So I began to see this neighborhood, this designed district, as both forward-looking and backward-looking. Okay, I've just done the brief recounting here to give you an idea of the sort of things that one can draw, one can observe, or one can, what's the best word, maybe infer from the landscape, the everyday landscape, when you look at it. Okay, so I will now go on to give more details about 3 of my 10 historical sites. Now I'm just have to sort of change my thinking a bit here, sorry. Now, maybe I'll just jump in here and say that there will, of course, be a question period at the end. And if anyone is interested in the sources of some of these things, I'm obviously not going to be saying anything about that now. But if anybody, I do cite the sources for the documents and historical photographs. But if anyone wants more information about it, you can certainly ask me and I can fill you in, because all this stuff does have sources to it. Okay. And this is the first of 3 then. I'll be talking for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, giving you the full story of 3 of the 10. This one I title, as I guess you can see on your screen, East of Silver Birch. This is undoubtedly a site that probably all of you, if all of you are neighborhood residents, will have seen at some point strolling along the beach. Now, I know when I first moved to the neighborhood, just getting to be many years ago now, I was struck by the fact that the park stopped where it did, there at Silver Birch, the boardwalk and the park itself. And it was a classic thing, you know, why is this the way it is? Why does this site look the way it looks? Well, the answer, I mean, many of you probably know this, but the answer is that the city was too cheap to expropriate the remaining housing. It wasn't really a commitment to preserving that housing. It was a reluctance to spend the money to get rid of it that caused this to be the case. Now, this is in 1931, when the city created Beaches Park. But there's more to this than that. So let me go on here. The first thing that I think is interesting, for those of you who don't know, is that there was building all along the lakefront on both sides of Silver Birch in the 1920s. Now, this is a photograph looking up Silver Birch from the frozen lake. This is the year when the lake froze, and it allowed the photographer to take this picture. But you can see the housing on the right. Now, just let me get my pointer on here. This housing here, most of it's still intact, although this house has been demolished and rebuilt. But here's a 1920s looking car on Silver Birch. And then here's all the housing that was between Silver Birch and Willow. Now, when the city decided to make the beach into a public park in the 1920s, There are two things to note about the city's plans. One of them is the park was to go all the way out to the city boundary at Victoria Park. It was not to stop here. The other thing, however, is that the park was to be just the beach. It was not going to have any inshore land incorporated into the park. So all the existing lakefront housing was going to remain. Now, this to me is, was a questionable supposition that the city made, because it wasn't going to be a very public beach if it was going to be lined with private properties. But nevertheless, the city was being parsimonious, as it often was and is. And this was the decision that it made. And when the city began expropriating the beach through the 1920s, that's what it did. It expropriated the beach. Now, it also had to expropriate the water lots. And some of you might not know what that means. I know I didn't until about 2 years ago. But the land under the lake is property, and you can own it. And this has been a concept in law for centuries, as far as I can see. It was intended mostly for people who were going to build things of a commercial nature, a dock or maybe a harbor, wharfage or something like that. So you could own the land under the water, called a water lot. And most of the original colonial land grants to the big lots along the beaches and everywhere else along water included the water lots with the property deed. So that the city was going to have to expropriate as well. But in 1930, before, as it sort of began conceptualizing the park more precisely, most of the expropriations had been done. The city changed its mind, and it resolved that it would in fact take a swath of inshore land and demolish all the housing on it in order to double the size of the park. And it began expropriating inshore land in 1930. But it ran into trouble when it came to the Balmy Beach Club, because the beach club, Balmy Beach Club, claimed with some justification, although I don't know, that it had a right to occupy its site in perpetuity. And the city did a bit of background research on this and concluded that it would just let it be. So it decided about 1929, I think it was, I don't have the exact date here, maybe it was 1930, that the Balmy Beach Club would stay as a private club in the public park. Now, this seems to have been a bit of an impediment to the expropriation of the inshore property, but the city did go so far as to expropriate all of this, which is the land just immediately east of the Balmy Beach Club, but it did go no further at Silver Birch. So this is sort of the beginning of the process. The city halted its expropriation. And it had no choice then but to stop its park here at Silver Birch. So this is a detail from the Parks Department's plan for the park, which is very interesting, I might say. It's not a document that I had seen reproduced anywhere. Maybe some of you have seen it, but has all the details of what the city planned to do in 1931. So here's the club left. And these boathouses were going to be rebuilt. The private boathouses will be demolished and a public boathouse will be built, and it's still there, called the Silver Birch Boathouse. So this was the city's decision as of 1931. Now, after the park opened, the city seriously considered extending it all the way out to the city boundary as it had originally planned. And city staff did a study of what it would have to expropriate to complete the park. And this is what it produced. This is only a quarter of the blueprint. And I did that way so that it's partly legible. It's a big blueprint. And it told the city council that it was going to cost $750,000 to expropriate all this property. And that was the end of it. So the city was not prepared to spend that kind of money to extend the park. The park was already in use by this time and very popular. And I guess it was just deemed okay as it was. So that was the end of it. And the park as of 1934 looked like this, remarkably like it does today. That's a view looking at the original house on Silver Birch there that has been replaced by a house which is remarkably similar. And I don't know, had no communication with the owner to know if they were deliberately replicating what they demolished, which is an interesting approach. But anyway, this is a view that, as I say, 1934, so it's just been a couple of years. The park's been in operation, and there is the private housing east of Silver Birch, still intact. Now, furthermore, so that's sort of one half of it. But the other thing is that I was always very interested in this. What is this building doing here? Why is there this private condominium right on the beach? I mean, this is not very common. And of course, it's hard to imagine such a thing being allowed now, 100 years later. So, and it is, of course, visible in this picture, off in the distance there, 1934. And it was assessed at $42,000 in the city staff report when it was trying to determine how much the city would have to pay. This building itself was $42,000 and the property was $8,000 and some. That's on that the blueprint that I just showed you. Okay, now so here's the story. The owner of this property was a man named Gardner, George Gardner. His name is spelled differently in different documents. And he owned this land. Here's the Goes Atlas in 1924. He owned lot 2. This is a subdivision from early 1887. Created these lot numbers here. He owned this thing with all the yellow, as most of you I'm sure know these Goes Atlases. Yellow depicts wood frame, wood cladding. So most of the small buildings on here were wood. And in 1925, he wanted to build an apartment building. And I might just say that this was the thing in the 1920s. Several other apartment buildings were being built in the neighborhood. So this was not unusual for him to propose this. But the city of Toronto, as of 1912, had a bylaw that prohibited the construction of apartment buildings in residential areas, on residential streets. So a person who wanted to do this had to apply to transgress the bylaw. And Gardner did this. He applied, he wrote a letter to the city, and the city building commissioner assessed it, reviewed it. Assess, I guess, is the wrong word in this context. Now, the procedure that the building commissioner followed in those days of citizen consultation was that he wrote a letter to numerous adjacent or nearby property owners to ask them what they thought. Do you allow me, he would say, do you allow us, the city, to transgress the bylaw in this case? Do you want to permit this builder to build an apartment building in this site? He wrote paper letters and waited for the responses. In this case, he reported later on that he sent out 35 letters to 35 property owners, I believe it is, owners, that were nearby. And he got the responses. Only 2 of the 35 people said yes. 15 of the 35 people opposed it, but 18 did not reply. So with only 15 of 35 explicitly opposed to the building, this was not a majority in opposition. So the building commissioner had no choice but to approve it. So he said to Mr. Gardner, go ahead and build your building. But he told Mr. Gardner he could not build the garage that was on his sketch. And so he didn't, and there's still no garage on that property. So that is how that building came about. There was a modest amount of citizen consultation, but in those days, indifference was considered endorsement. So there was not enough opposition to stop it. So what we have in that site is a demonstration of what citizen participation was like in the 1920s. So overall then, that's a lot of history in one site, but that's what I have uncovered about east of Silver Birch. It exists because of municipal parsimony, and the most noticeable building on it exists because of quite liberal interpretation of opposition. Now, I feel as if there should be an opportunity for questions now, but that's impractical. So if you have questions about east of Silver Birch, make a note, and I'll do my best to answer them in the question period. The good thing about questions, of course, is that they allow the speaker to stop speaking, which I always enjoy. But anyway, on to the next. Here's another site that unquestionably anyone who lives in the neighborhood will have seen. These buildings that line the boardwalk between Winneva and Glen Manor. Now, there's two separate historical narratives that intersect in the creation, the construction of these buildings. One of them is the Beaches Park, again, which was created through the 1920s into 1930-31. But the other one is the redevelopment of the Scarborough Beach Amusement Park site, which is itself a very interesting and kind of complex story. Now, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the city began the process of creating Eastern Beaches Park in the 1920s. And I think it's important to realize as a background point here that the neighborhood's entire beach by 1920s, the neighborhood's entire beach had become very nearly a private domain over the course of, well, one, maybe two generations, depending on where you start the dating. Now, there's no doubt about this. We have lots of photographs, I mean, hundreds, maybe thousands of photographs, stuff like this. Here's Q Beach, 1918, with these kind of front yards created in front of these private homes. But it's almost a private beach. Sort of over here, I guess, you know, this would be a walkway where the street was. You could get down here and walk along, but people are going to be sitting in and tending. You're going to feel like you're on someone's private beach. And here's the other end, Balmy Beach, at the same time. Concrete retaining wall, fairly substantial boathouses here. And of course, children. Children are, unsupervised children are everywhere in urban photographs in the 1920s and 30s. It's quite interesting. Now, this was legal generally in most, not every place, but in most cases it was perfectly legal to you know, infringe upon or make use of the beach in this way. Because many of these properties did own the beach in front of their homes. But this had never really been, no one had ever decided it should be this way. And it did not sit well with municipal forces that were in favor of public parks. I mean, as many of you know, I'm sure, this urban reform movement of the early 20th century, public open space was an important priority. And a lot of money was spent on creating parks in a city like Toronto in the first decades of the 20th century. I mean, a lot of money was spent on other things like water and sewer services, but expanding the public parks was important. Is the conviction that what we now call the public realm was important. So the presence of all of this private ownership of the beaches did not sit well among the urban reformers who were advocates of public parks. And this, as I say, this underlies the whole process, the whole program of creating Eastern Beaches Park. So anyway, the city passed its expropriation bylaws, the same thing that I've said about the other site. In 2021, it passed these bylaws initially to expropriate just the beach and the water lots. But these bylaws, interestingly, they explicitly left out the property in front of the Scarborough Beach Amusement Park. The park would not sell. I mean, they owned the water lot. They had obtained it with the farm when they bought it in 1907. So it was, and this is the front of the Scarborough Beach Amusement Park waterfront. I mean, the railway company that owned it is not going to be too keen about giving this up. It would have transformed their whole enterprise. I like this photograph. I'll just make a tangential comment about it. In at least one, maybe two memoirs about growing up in the beaches in the early 20th century, the point was made that residents of Balmy Beach would sometimes paddle their canoes down in front of Scarborough Beach Amusement Park on Sunday evenings to hear live music performances for free. I don't know how common this was, but this, of course, is an evening photograph. And I say, of course, because the shadows tell us that. And for those of you who don't know, shadow angles are the way to tell the time on photographs if the sun is shining. It also helps you get oriented north, south, east, and west. But in this case, we don't need that. We know this. But anyway, so that's a little side point about this particular photograph. One wonders if those are people there to hear the free music. Anyway, that's not really the point here. The point here is that it was an integral part of a commercial enterprise, and it's no surprise that the railway company did not refuse to sell. But when the park shut down in 1925, situation suddenly changed. The entire park site was taken over by Provident Investments with the obvious intention of developing the site with housing. They were a residential property developer. They were building houses just the other side of Queen Street. But the last thing the city wanted was a new residential enclave with its own private beach and water lot. So it promptly purchased the beach and water lot from Provident Investments for a premium price. But it felt it had no choice. So the city went against its natural parsimonious instincts and paid a premium to get the beach and water lot in front of this on the verge of becoming a new residential enclave. Now, Provident Investments promptly subdivided its entire holding. This is a registered plan of subdivision for the whole area. Amusing to me as well because of the swamp, which is depicted here, a wetland that would bedevil the housing on Glen Manor for 100 years to come. But anyway, part of this plan of subdivision was down here along the beach. There was to be a new street called Hubbard Boulevard, and there were 12 plus 6, 18 lots. Let me go to a close-up of that part. 18 lots that were sort of right along the beach here, along the southern border. So now anyone can see, and surely the city saw as well when they saw the subdivision, that these properties are going to be on the beach. And I'm sure this made some of the authorities start scratching their heads about this. But as I said before, they had accepted that their park would be only the beach. But the idea of new housing on the beach didn't sit too well with them. And it so happens that by 1927, the city also knew that these 4 lots here had been bought by a builder. And the builder was obviously about to build on these 4 lots. Now, the city made no attempt to stop the builder from building. It was the Furness family, by the way, Eliza Furness and her husband, who lived over in east of Silverbirch, actually, and they had bought these properties. The city could not stop them. I wouldn't be surprised if they had already got a building permit by late 1927. I don't know for sure. But in any case, the city didn't try and stop them, but what the city did is it immediately expropriated all the remaining lots along here. All 14 of these lots it expropriated from the owners in 1927. And now these properties were then going to be put into the park. This is actually the beginning of the expansion of the park to include inshore land. I think this was an important turning point, this expropriation. Anyway, so by buying it, they blocked any further housing along this border of the subdivision. And they basically realized, it seems to me, that they were going to have to buy some of the inshore land. Now, but the Furnisses responded to this by immediately building. And by 1928, they had put 5 structures on these 4 lots. 3 pairs of semis, 1 detached house, and 1 small apartment building. Now, as noted earlier, though, the city decided that it was going to expropriate everything in 1930 and demolish everything. So it expropriated these new houses, including some houses here, by the way, which I haven't mentioned, but the Furnisses also ended up buying this lot and putting 3 pairs of semis facing Winneba on that as well. But this seems to have been the sore point initially, these 4 lots here. So yeah, so the city has decided then to expropriate everything in 1930, 3 years later, and it expropriated all these houses. But the city decided at the last minute, it seems to me, judging from the documents, that they would not demolish them. Because these houses, unlike a lot of the old cottages, these houses were newly built, they were brick, they were well built, they suited the neighborhood. These kind of semis and small apartments were everywhere in the new development. So they decided to keep them. Not only that, but they decided, here we have it, that they would build the park around it. So this is the explanation for this anomaly of having these residential properties in the park. The city decided not to expropriate and demolish them. So not only that, but they would decided they would rent them out for a little bit of revenue. So the irony of this whole thing is that the city ended up as the landlord of the buildings it did not want, which struck me as kind of a curious outcome of this thing. But this story, there's still more to this, actually. There's another couple of concluding points here. The city could not have been surprised when it saw the actual houses. As I say, these semi-detached houses and apartment buildings were going up, right in the next block. But what I think might have surprised them is that the Furnisses put back doors and garages on the fronts of the houses, because these houses fronted on Hubbard Boulevard, right? I mean, their address is on Hubbard Boulevard in this plan of subdivision. They put garages on the front doors, and they put porches and front doors on the backs of the houses. So you get, here's the front of the 5 and 7 Hubbard Boulevard. And here's the back of 5 and 7 Hubbard Boulevard. So the builders had cleverly created, unmistakably, beachfront houses, exactly what the city did not want. So the city really was the landlord of the houses it did not want. Now, one final concluding point about this is that some of these houses, and I haven't taken the time to get this straight, but some of these are designated as historical houses and they're protected. Heritage houses, I guess is the word. But the heritage designation was given without any knowledge of what I have just said to you. This is all new knowledge. I know this, and now you know this. So it makes the designation of these houses a little bit curious, because basically what we have here is the city being outfoxed by a clever entrepreneurial builder. But I say, since the Beaches neighborhood was created by clever entrepreneurial builders, they should be commemorated for that. So there should be a plaque here, not saying that these are whatever it is that they're designate them for now. I think it's because they're the last houses with direct access to the beach or something. they should be protected as evidence of the city being outfoxed by its entrepreneurial builders. Okay. So that's the end of that, and you can't ask any questions until the end. Okay, last of my three here. And once again, a site that I'm sure many of you have seen, this curious run of townhouses on the southwest corner of Waverly in Norway. Now, this is, I live in the east end of the beaches, and so I don't walk around this area as much as the other, but every time I walked around it over the years, I found myself curious. So I decided I wanted to go into the municipal records, try and find out something about this. So this is historical site number 3. Now, as you all know, those of you who live here, the whole neighborhood was once drained by multiple streams, and their vestiges can be found here and there throughout the neighborhood. In fact, it was one of those vestiges that initially drew me to this. I was interested in the big old weeping willow trees along Kenilworth, which are such clear vestiges of the Kenilworth floodplain. But as I began investigating the Kenilworth floodplain, I got intrigued by the creek itself, and my historical site then settled on this site, not the big willow trees, although they're very interesting as well. Okay, so Norway Creek flows westerly through the neighborhood. It flows out of the high ground here on the Ames estate. This is in 1913. Right across here, and eventually goes down the hill and into the low, flat wetland down here, which is Kenilworth. It's still, as I just say, vestiges of that floodplain still intact. Now, as the creek flowed through here, there was what might be described as a valley. That may be a bit of an overstatement, but you can see the hatching on the drawing of this Godes Atlas here shows you the beginning of the ravine borders. This is probably, close to 100 feet wide, 10, 20 feet deep. It's a gradual slope down. It's not a sudden valley, but it's not nothing. And the only street that had something approximating a bridge, as we can see depicted here, was Lee Avenue, which was an original road allowance created in the mid-19th century. And we can get a good sense of it, by good fortune there's a photograph of that very thing about the year of the Godes Atlas. This is looking north, Lee Avenue, from the high ground. And you can see the land going down, and we can't see the structure in this picture. There probably isn't much of a structure. My guess, knowing something about 19th century railway construction, is that there's probably a culvert there, and then just earth over top of it. I don't know. Maybe it's just earth. Maybe it's just fill. But in any case, you get a sense of the depth and the breadth of this low land, which we can see in this drawing. Notice that the other streets, not Lee, but Wheeler, Belfair, and Waverly, they all just run right through this low land without any bridges or any indication. Now, the reason for that is because the plans of subdivision, and here's the one for Waverly. This was 1906 subdivision plan. The private owner of this land subdivided it into 48 lots. We go back to this thing here. That number 1 is right there. So that's Waverly Road going up and down. Now, these plans of subdivision were fanciful. The owner thought he might be able to sell these lots, but he didn't, because clearly what's going on here is that no one is building in this wet ground. So putting in the lots in the plan of subdivision does not dry the land. So no surprise that the land was not built on. Now, if we look closely then at Waverly, which is what I'm going to concentrate on here. This is the same map, just blown up. What we can see here is that the building has clearly stopped at the brow of the hill, the downslope. The last property built on is this lot number 1 of that plan of subdivision, and there's 2 wooden frame, wooden clad houses on that 50-foot lot. That's as far as any builder would go. Now, keep in mind that plan of subdivision has been in place for at least 10 years, and nobody has built. But in 1914, housing demand was so strong that a builder bought lot 2 and put up 2 houses on it. They're brick houses. One he sold, the northerly of the 2, and one he rented. The site was precarious. The north side of the northerly house was on a slight downslope. And in 1917, only 3 years after it was built, this is what happened. This is the house that the builder built in 1914, the northerly one. This is looking south across the rough, wettish ground towards the side that collapsed. The house itself remained intact, but the owner obviously had a major repair to do. Now, there is a bit of a curious detail that I might mention in here. This is a concrete wall. Concrete as a foundation material was not fully understood by all builders in the early 20th century. And I say this having read the building code from 1912 that gave all sorts of details about what you should and shouldn't do with concrete. It's possible this builder just didn't do it right. You've got to pour your concrete all at once so you don't get any weak seams in it, et cetera, et cetera. But in any case, the hill was clearly a factor here because the foundation wall is almost completely exposed. So that's a problem. It so happens that around the time of this, just shortly after this foundation wall collapsed, the city decided that it was going to build Waverley Road in a proper configuration. It was going to fill the wetland, grade the street, and surface it with something. Now, why the city decided to do this in 1917, I have no explicit evidence. But the city had annexed this land in 1909, and it was improving the infrastructure everywhere. So it's not unexpected, it's not too weird that the city decided to do this. But I can't help but wonder if the collapse of that foundation wall had something to do with it. Because the city architect did investigate, he was called in to investigate that foundation failure. So I don't know, it doesn't really matter. The fact is, the city decided to fill and properly grade Waverley Road in, by about 1920 or so. No, I'm sorry, I'm mistaken. Look at my own notes here to clarify. It was sooner than that. It was right after 1917 that the city chose to finish Waverley Road. Now, the consequence of this filling was that more of the lots, let me go, I think I've got, yes, I do. Okay, good. More of the lots became buildable lots. And sure enough, the man who owned lots 3 and 4, as soon as not to mention 2, the house was repaired. But the man who owned 3 and 4 he now found that his lots, which used to be on soggy bottomlands, are now on a good city street. So he wasted no time. The man's name was Barron with 2 R's, Harvey J. Barron, who was around. He built houses in the area off and on quite a few years. Some of you may have come across him. I say he wasted no time, and he put up a run of 8 attached townhouses on his 2 50-foot lots, retaining ownership, renting them out, and he had tenants in all 8 by the end of 1918. And here's what they look like today, close up. This is not all 8 of them. This is only 5. But this is how they look today. So these are the things he built in a hurry as soon as he had his level street in front of him in 1918. So my question, though, about this is, why did he build townhouses? all the other builders in the area were putting up either detached houses or small semi-detached houses. And the answer, unfortunately, is I don't know. I wanted to find this, and in all the sources I looked at, nothing really answered the question. But what I can say is that Waverley had become largely a working class street by the time it was built up at this time. Earlier, when in the high ground, some larger houses had been built, but that was not the new Waverley Road. And these townhouses looked so much like what was being built in England for the working classes in the post-World War I years. It seems, anyway, this may have been a factor. I'm sure it was a factor that this was becoming a low-income neighborhood. And so this is a suitable kind of housing, especially if he was going to rent them. But the other point that can't be overlooked is that he was limited by the fact that the city, let me show you this map again. When the city filled to build Waverley Road, it only filled the road. It just piled the dirt up as wide as the street, or a little wider than the street, but not much. So there was a steep grade behind these properties. You don't see it on this drawing, but all these lots, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, they all were only really about half the width, and then they steeply graded off the back. So he didn't have a lot of room to put his houses. So this surely contributed as well. He had only 2 lots, and he put 8 houses on them because he couldn't build very far back. So the story continues because a year later, the city made another decision to do more filling and to fill all the rest of Norway Creek. The whole thing was going to get filled up. This was a major public work undertaking that ran for a couple of years, and it involved regrading Wheeler and Belfair as well, which as of this point, see, they also had low wet ground. They also had wooden houses on them that were probably not going to last very long. So that was part of the job, that they had to fill and regrade these 2 streets as well, having already done Waverley. So they did. Through the early 1920s, they filled it, and they created a new street, which they called Norway Avenue, over top of the fill, where the creek used to be. Now this, by good fortune, is a photograph of this very thing. Now, it took me a while to get this oriented, apart from the fact that it has the pine trees that gave the area its name of Norway, which is a clever little thing. This is Norway Avenue here, and this is Belfair. And this is looking southwest. So we can see what's been filled. Here's the low ground. So they filled this. Now, when you go along Belfair, it goes down slightly to Norway and then goes back up as it heads north towards Kingston Road. So they didn't raise Norway up to the full height. There's still a bit of a slope there, but that you can see how much they had to fill. And eventually these were built in. They were more filled and more houses were put in. Here's kids again, you see. I tell you, they're everywhere. So what happened now, though, was that Mr. Barron, who owned a lot of this property, put in some more new housing. First of all, on Waverley. So here's his lot 5 and 6. Here's 3 and 4. His first 8 townhouses. Here's 5 and 6. Now 6 partly abbreviated because he had got some of the property was used for the street. It's expropriated. But he squeezed a couple more in there. And then a year or so later, when everything was filled, he extended his townhouses all along there. So he ended up with townhouses on lot 3, 4, 5, and 6 around the corner. And that is the site that we see to this day. Norway Creek was gone, and it was replaced by Harvey J. Barron's townhouses. Now, if we return back to the present, just to sort of start wrapping this up, this is a little tricky because it is true that these unique townhouses exist only because the Creek Valley was filled and Norway Creek disappeared. But I cannot claim that their uniqueness is due to the disappearance of Norway Creek. So I'm sort of on shaky ground here in my logic of my argument. Barron could have put another form of housing on this site, right? He didn't have to put townhouses, but he did. And I stick with this because some of the features of the housing are directly related to the filling, especially, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the fact that the lots dropped off at the back on account of the city's limited landfill. And this made the houses very shallow. And if you go around to the back, which maybe some of you have, you will see that all of these townhouses have really deep sub-basements. The housing actually is built down the slope along with the slope behind the grading. But the other thing is that back there is all the unfilled low ground. It's still there. And also, if you look at the houses along Norway, some of them have cracked exterior walls. Actually, you can see a patch there. At least I can on the size I have. And I spoke to one of the occupants of these things, and he didn't have good things to say about the structural stability of his townhouse. So I feel like the consequences of it, I don't know. There's a connection, let's put it that way, between these townhouses, their design, their current structural state, and the fact that this is filled Norway Creek. Now, there is one other curious element that I'm just going to steal a couple more minutes here before I stop. I'm nearly done. But this at the very northern, or the very southerly end of this run of townhouses, that's the last of the townhouses, is this detached house. And this is the house that foundation collapsed. And when Harvey Barron built his townhouses, he put the wall of his townhouse right almost touching the wall of the detached house. And I was intrigued to discover that Harvey Barron had bought this house before he started building his townhouses. So he owned this place and he could build right up against it, presumably to stabilize the wall of this house, which he now owned, as well as give him a solid structure for his townhouses. So if you walk down the street a little further, which is what I am maybe 40 or 50 meters south on Waverly here, looking west, you can see this what seems to be a joined wall. I spoke to the owner of this house about it, and no one is certain whether they're actually touching. I think probably they're not, but they look like they are, and they're very close. Structurally, they'd be connected. So that's one more little curious feature of this this historical site. And that's a lot, but I'm finished. So I will now unshare my PowerPoint and turn it back over to Glenn Chadwick. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. And yes, that was very interesting details about some of our little neighborhood streets. And I have seen some of those photos, and I remember that one of the collapsed house. And I knew there was a lot of water that was responsible for that. So very interesting. And I live on Lee Avenue, but fortunately a little further south, so we don't have that stream running through. In any case, we're now going to try and answer a few questions if anybody has them. And I just have a couple of guidelines here again for the way you can ask questions. For most people, I think you can type in your question, which is number 2 here. Open the chat window and type in a brief message. And then there is another way of doing this, which is to use the Zoom controls and raise your hand. And then I think we know how to get your voice on, but we'll try typing in the message for the time being. I think that'll work a little better. So so let's see if we have. I will open up the chat here, and let's see. A few people are saying awesome presentation. Very interesting presentation. Thank you. And Paul Overy is saying, thank you, Richard, very interesting. And he has to leave for another meeting. Wow. Anyway, Clyde, most excellent. Who would know? Thank you very much. So we haven't got any questions yet. Let's see if we have any further down here. Fabulous presentation. Thanks. And yeah, I believe it's a good idea to go visit some of these locations. Maybe Richard, you can organize a tour, and that would be probably really interesting. A nice sub thing to this presentation here. Maybe when the weather gets a little better, though. Definitely not tomorrow. So very detailed and a great presentation. And Birgit has her hand up. So let me see.
Yeah.
There we go.
Glenn, if you put on the gallery view, you'll be able to see people's hands up if they're up.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I do have a couple of comments, and this was an amazing bit of research and investigation. I really appreciated it. Specific to the houses on Waverly, I have a question for you. I've always wondered about those townhouses and also why they have the flat roof, especially since they were built that early. I was wondering if there were restrictions on how high he could go, the bearing capacity. I also noted have been perplexed about how short the front doors are. They're less than a standard 6'9", 7-foot door that would have been more appropriate. So curious, Richard, whether you have any sleuthing you've done on that.
Am I live here now? Can I speak?
Yes. Yes, you are.
Okay. Well, I can't answer those specific questions because I have not encountered anything about either of those details. But I can say a couple of things more generally. I would be really surprised if there was any sort of control over the height of that building. For one thing, the building regulations, which I have looked at more than any human should have to do, and I've got a lot of stuff in my book on this, and because they just weren't being enforced. There weren't very many of them, and they weren't being enforced. So something as specific as the height of a building, it just makes no sense to me that they would be tight restrictions on them. The only restriction that I came across in those things was if a building was over 35 feet high, it had to have more, there was a closer scrutiny of its structure. So there was an incentive to build under 35 feet, because you might bring out the building inspector if you were over 35 feet. 35 feet is well higher than those buildings are, so I can't imagine that was a factor. I think that a lot of it can be explained by the weirdness of the whole thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just Mr. Barron, he was squeezing in houses into a site that barely was big enough for what he was doing. And I think that that would probably explain a lot of the anomalies in those buildings. Just so I would give that sort of general response that the whole circumstances would have contributed to the oddness of those things.
Mm-hmm.
That's the best I can do for that, to answer that.
Well, thank you. The door heights are the things, one of the things I've pondered many times going past, because as an architect, those are very low doors. They are not designed for even what would have been typical at that time. So I guess he was trying to save money. Yeah,
a few dollars here and there on the buildings, because the neighborhood is built by builders who were, I mean, they were building products to sell. I mean, it was a big factory of housing, and a few dollars here and there, 2x8s instead of 2x10s. There's just corners cut everywhere that was feasible on these things, and I wouldn't be surprised. but also isn't it kind of proportional? I mean, one thing I should say is that Mr. Barron actually moved into one of these things. He was out and about building here and there through the 19 teens and 20s. But in the 30s, I think it was, I found he was resident in the southernmost of them, I think. So he thought they were okay, and he lived there till he died, actually. And he also kept owning them. He kept owning them. He was the landlord. I mean, this was fairly common in the neighborhood too. I was fascinated to discover this. The house I live in was owned by its builder for 40 years. He built 6 houses and owned them all, and he rented them out for his income. But so he lived in there until he died, and sometime after the Second World War. So they were good enough for him, which I think is not insignificant. So anyway, a few more little details that might be relevant. But we got lots of other questions, so I should try and move on here.
Yes, well, we have a question from William Lukachuk, and his question is, when and why did the amusement park close?
The amusement park, like every other of those things in the world, or in North America anyway, closed because people stopped going to them. They just lost their cachet. They were the place to go until they weren't. And you know, that's a simple way of saying of a complex historical causation. I mean, if you start digging into it, you find people using automobiles, going further. Amusement park at the end of the streetcar line was not a place to go. People, you know, they just fell out of favor. So the railway company had owned it since 1907, and I'm sure that they always assumed that they would eventually develop it with residential property. So it was kind of a playing out of their long-term business plan. So I think it was not really a surprise. The surprise for them was, of course, that the railway company was bankrupt when it sold it, because the city of Toronto had created the public transportation system in 1921, which basically put the Toronto Railway Company out of business over the course of a few years. And so that was another contributing factor, I imagine. But the property itself, the land, the site, was listed in a legal list of things that were being sold with the bankruptcy of the Toronto Railway Company. So there's another reason for them to shut down. But really, though, my first point, I return to that. The literature, such as it is on amusement parks, they do seem to have petered out in the 1920s. They just fell out of favor.
Yes, and that's when the Price brothers came in and built all those fourplexes. And I just want to do a little plug for our website, which has, as I said before, a lot of very interesting information on it, and I encourage everybody to look at it. But we have one great little section on the Scarborough Beach Amusement Park, and it's an interactive place where you can click on a little map, and you can see a view of what was there, and you can actually walk to the area and do this if you have a data plan and a cell phone. So that's a very interesting thing. It's like a sort of live then and now experience. And while I'm talking about our website, I just want to mention that Richard's research, all of his 10 locations in the beach are featured on our website under the resources page, I believe. And so if you want to look at a little bit more of what Richard has researched, along with the photographs and maps and plans and so forth, just go to our website, and I think it's the resources area, and that's where there's a lot of that information and much more information too. So we have another question that I'll just read out, and it's from Tom Middleton, and he just wants to know, Richard, when is your new book coming out?
I wish I knew. The book, the book is done, or at least the book was done. My publisher fell asleep back in March of 2022. For a story, I do not know why, but there was some sort of personal reason. I mean, it's not like it's a fly-by-night operation. It's University of Toronto Press, but they had the manuscript as of March last year, and I don't know why. It's maybe it's not a priority. Maybe they were short of staff. Maybe there were production problems. But I was recently in touch with the publisher, my editor, my acquisitions editor, as they're called, just a few weeks ago, and he claims that he's on the job. So I'm taking the opportunity to do another final revision of it. I dug up a lot of new stuff when I did these historical sites research. So I'm squeezing all that back into the book, which to its betterment, I think. So the delay, I can't really complain about it. But I think I can say that it will come out in 2023. I hope it will be in the middle of 2023, but it might be into the second half.
Okay, great. And maybe we'll have another presentation at that point, or a live in-person book launching. I think.
Yeah, I would, sure. Once we get to that stage, I would definitely like to do that. And the question just popped up there from Birgit. Is that how you pronounce your name? Birgit?
Yeah.
What I'm researching now is like today, I am doing the final revisions to the manuscript of the book. As I say, I'm squeezing all this stuff into it, and I'm doing a bit of research to confirm some of the details that I'm adding in. But that's going to be finished in the next week or two. And then I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to do. I think I might paint the bathroom.
Okay.
So my next major research project, I haven't decided for sure.
Well,
Can
you
we
might get some
submit
ideas.
suggestions? Can we submit suggestions to you somehow? If we
Sure.
if we think there's a wonderful mystery that we would love you to explore for your next one.
The only I say yes with some caveat, and that is that I find myself my interest is going elsewhere. I've been immersed in my own local neighborhood for a few years, and I'm starting to think more about other cities. And so I'm not sure that I necessarily want to keep researching the local area. But, you know, once the questions get asked, I want to find the answers.
So we have a few more questions here, or
I can give a quick answer to these things that are popping up,
Yeah.
if you don't mind, Glenn.
okay.
A lot of the stuff that I do, I can do at home. But the property assessment roles, which are critical to this sort of research, are only in microfilm at the archives. So you have to go to the archives to do that. There's one question about whether I can do all my research at home. I don't like doing all my research at home. I like going to the archives and finding things that I didn't know I was looking for. But a lot of this stuff can be done at home.
And there is a message from Barbara. I don't know if you saw that one, but
I did not. No, I was talking when it
so-
popped up.
yeah, I'll just read it for the benefit of everybody. And it's Barbara says, was not the opening of Sunnyside a factor in the demise of Scarborough Beach Amusement Park? Also, who designed the apartments on the lake east of Silver Birch? I understand, and that would be the Glenfern building, I believe. I understand it was Howard Addison Johnston, not Mr. Gardner. So that's maybe a clarification of some sort.
Okay, well, can I respond to that?
Yep.
Yeah. As for who designed them, I imagine they were designed by the person who built them, because that was their conventional thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
But I have seen Addison Johnston's name mentioned here and there as well. And I'm afraid that I think that's wrong. I mean, you know, maybe we can argue about this, but it was Mr. Gardner who wrote a letter to the city commissioner asking for permission to build the building. And it was Mr. Gardner who is on the assessment rolls as owning the property. And it's Mr. Gardner who is on that blueprint of the assessment as the owner of that building in 1932. Now, Addison Johnston owned and designed and built the house beside it. And in fact, the one on the corner, I think too, is his. So I'm only repeating what I'm finding in my sources. And, these things can be wrong. But that's what those are the three sources that I have that are, the letter to the city seems particularly convincing to me, that it was Mr. Gardner who got permission to build that building. So maybe the actual building was done by Edison Johnson, because you see, Gardner, I don't think was a builder. It's very hard to get personal details about these people, but there was some reference to the fact that he was an employee with a company downtown, and he lived on Kingswood. So he might have owned the property, and he might have hired Addison Johnson to build it for him. So that may be why I see his name in the correspondence with the city, and in the ownership of the property, and in the ownership of the building. But the actual building was done by Addison Johnson. Yeah,
Okay.
the directories are online. Sure,
Yeah.
that's where I used them.
Yeah.
That's where I saw Gardner's name.
Yeah.
That's
So this is Barbara again, mentioning to everyone that all of the Toronto city directories from 1833 to 2001 are now online, which I think a lot of people would be interested in, because if you know somebody, perhaps the person who owned your house at one time, you can look them up alphabetically in the directory, perhaps. So that's interesting. Our first owner was a photographer, and we're always interested in knowing a bit more about him. But I believe that's all our questions at this point, and it's good because it's about time to wrap it up, I believe. And so if we can get the next screen.
I see. Of course, I'm seeing Barbara's response here. That's right. Of course,
Yes.
Yeah, I haven't done any research in the more recent years, so for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the important development, that the more modern ones are online.
Yes. Yeah. So anyway, I'd like to thank everybody for attending. First of all, we had a pretty good turnout, about 40 people from what I could count. And we definitely want to thank our presenter, Richard White, in his very informative presentation. And behind the scenes, we have our co-host and our technical advisor, Jonathan Bradshaw. And Jonathan is hiding behind one of these black screens here, but we'll be hearing more from him down the road. And just once again, we would like to encourage everybody to join the society and/or renew your membership and support heritage in our neighborhood, and to help us continue doing these programs. And we also would like people to try and get involved in any way. You just have to contact us, and you can contact us through the website. Some of you could contact us directly. You know who we are. And certainly if you're not on our mailing list, the best way to do that is to become a member. And if you want to get involved, of course, get in touch through our website. And the website is at the bottom of the page here, and it's full of very interesting information. I should also mention our Facebook page, which is ongoing, regular, almost daily postings and so forth. So that's a very good place to go. You don't have to be a member of Facebook to go on the Facebook page. And the link is through our website. So again, thanks very much to Richard for a great presentation here. And thanks everybody for attending. And we hope to see you again soon. We're trying to set up another presentation in the next month or so. And we're also hoping to try and do some in-person presentations, but it's dependent upon a number of factors. COVID, of course, being one of them, but other issues at this point in time too. So we'll stay in touch and hope to see you again soon. And thanks, Richard, and everybody. Thank you very much and good night.
Thank you very much.